I'm very interested in the issue of theatricality. In Eisenstein's earlier films, he uses theatrical gestures, usually in cases where he parodies characters, such as the capitalist strike or some of the spectators at the Odessa steps. In his later films, in particular in Alexander Nevsky and in this film, the theatricality seems to undo his own work. For instance, in this film, in a sequence where Ivan is crawling around the floor trying to find support from the boyars, one gets sequences that may be up to a minute long where it's getting very powerful, and then he grasps the robe of one boyar, and the boyar just rolls his eyes, and he shatters the spell, and it takes another minute or so for it to come back again. I have a feeling, I get the sense that he really wasn't in control of the theatricality that he was using the way he would have liked, or was he deliberately trying to destroy a spell? Because the film doesn't.
Well, you have described a somewhat subjective. Well, you have described a reaction of yours in subjective terms. That is to say, he does this and then it breaks the spell. What you are saying, of course, is that you are no longer under, in some particular state of tension or of spell. And you were asking me if Eisenstein intended for you to have that subjective reaction. I am not concerned with what Eisenstein intended my reactions to be, so much as I am interested in describing the film, and in doing so, that is describing a certain kind of object. I always assume that a filmic object or any work of art is a consciously conceived object on the part of its maker. I also know, by the way, that works can gather resonance, can lose resonance, in time. But I cannot answer your question and say, yes, Eisenstein intended you to feel less intensely about this than you think you should, or no, he did not, because I cannot see into the mind of Eisenstein in that way. That does not seem to me to be part of the work of either history or criticism. Yes?
But my question was in partly stimulated by the fact that the audience responded basically the same way I did. There would be almost ripples of laughter at certain points when these moments would occur. This is partly stimulated, I think, because he so consciously and successfully uses it in his earlier films, these theatrical devices, to ridicule certain characters, and then it seems to pop up in his later films, almost by accident.
Well, there I disagree with you. What's interesting about, say, Strike, is that actually the direction of actors, and as well as the imagery, the framing, the camera angles, etc., the lighting, is conceived actually on two somewhat different levels. And there are levels which correspond to class differences. That is, we have very broad caricature kinds of characterizations, reinforced by lighting, silhouette, costume, makeup, whatever. And then you have a whole other level, which are not caricatural. The first corresponds generally to the dominant class, which is, say, the factory owners. The other correspond to the workers. In addition, the major metaphors, which is to say, the cop who is seen as a fox, or the other, the cop who is seen as an owl, are spies, are policemen. The workers are never seen as animals. They are never seen metaphorically. So that both metaphor and caricature, in those early films actually, are used to establish class differences, and that is to establish the basis for class struggle. So that it seems to me that something very, very different is at work here, because here there is a much more homogeneous kind of distribution, if you like, of the effect of stylization, broadness of movement, makeup, gesture, use of drapery, and so on, We find it not only in Ivan and Basmanov, but we also find it in Kurbsky, Serafima, Vladimir, and so on. So I think, I can't account for your particular reaction, but I think that structurally the film is conceived much more homogeneously. It's conceived also in a manner far more outrageous, to one's sense of verisimilitude. But that is one of the chief glories of the film, I think. Now, what is, I think, also interesting to note is the fact that it introduces in the 40s, in the early 40s, an element of theatricalization and extremity, outrageous extremity of theatricalization, which was unique at the time, which was undoubtedly shocking at the time, but which is somewhat reintroduced later on in the 60s by people like Straub and Godard. That is, there is a sense in which the radicalization of European cinema of the 60s comes through the reintroduction of the theatrical. Straub and Godard are certainly the outstanding examples of that. Godard will insert Brechtian playlet into the middle of the film, like 2 or 3 things I know about. Straub will actually film as part of The Bridegroom of Captain Robert. He actually films a production of a play and has people acting in very outrageously theatrical manners. So, and the whole introduction of Brecht and the notion of distance, and the distancing techniques into the kind of radical European cinema of the 60s now might be seen as having been having had a prelude, if you like, in the work of Eisenstein in the 40s. Yes.
Didn't Godard, though, use theatricality as an alienation effect, whereas presumably in this film we're expected to ride with it?
I don't know what we're expected to do. I mean, you know what I don't know what I'm expected to do. I know what I do, but I don't know what I'm expected to do. As I say, I can describe the object on one hand. I can certainly describe my own reactions, but I wouldn't posit my own reactions necessarily as what I'm expected to do. In any case, I think that it's impossible to see this film without realizing that everybody in it is acting, and not only is everybody in it acting, but they're acting people who are constantly acting. That there's a sense in which people are constantly playing roles before each other. Ivan is constantly kind of trying on certain attitudes for size. I mean, it's obvious. And there's a kind of alternation, between kind of direct thrust of a grand, imperious, large-scale emotion and the fact that he's play acting part of the time.
Do you think Eisenstein was smuggling a mannered film into a realist aesthetic by assuming that people
You can't smuggle this into anything. I mean, it's absolutely, it's up front. I mean, it's up front all the time.
Well, in the case of Young Mr. Lincoln, the idea is that, it's like living in the 19th century. Would the analogy be that this is like living in the 16th century?
Well, there you have a point. I mean, there you raise another point, which I think is interesting. Of course, there's a certain irony, obviously, in Eisenstein's homage to Ford, of which he must himself have been very conscious. I mean, certainly, nobody ever made a film more unlike a Ford film than this, artificial object we've just been looking at. But there is also a quality in which the excessive, as it seems to us, emotion, the excessive theatricality, the intensively exteriorized action of Ivan does speak to us in a way of the manner in which people behaved in the 16th century. In Wietzinger's Reign in the Middle Ages, for example, he talks about the way in which not simply grim men, but great warriors and kings were physically expressive in a way that men no longer are. The way in which body contact was more frequent between people. Men wept openly. Kings would weep openly. and so on. And one sees a great deal about it, particularly Item Part 2, which you haven't looked at yet. So there is an element of a certain kind of reconstitution of the historical era through this largeness of gesture and expression.
I think that one of the reasons why this film might have been considered a throwback, and the same thing happened to Citizen Kane in 1941, is that thinking in particular, The Devil Was a Woman and the Informer, films in both in 1935, which were kind of the proofing out of it. Although they're good films, they're the last gasp of expressionism.
Yes.
And they have a lot of the qualities of this film.
Yes, and certainly, if one is going to think about, if one's going to think about a Hollywood director related to Eisenstein, Von Sternberg is an extremely interesting person to think about. I mean, somebody who obviously looked at Eisenstein very carefully. And there's a great deal that one could say about that. I mean, there are obviously two directors who looked carefully at Eisenstein. One of them was Sternberg, the other was Wells. And there exists, by the way, an interview given by Wells to the Cahiers du Cinema in 1966, in which he says that, he simply mentions, somewhat parenthetically, that when Ivan the Terrible came out, that he wrote a review of it, largely unfavorable. He said he did not care for Eisenstein's costume drawings. And he sent it to Eisenstein, and Eisenstein replied with a 30-page letter. And there then ensued a correspondence between them. Well, when I read that, I found that very exciting. And a few years later, I was directing a film publications program for a publisher in New York. And so I decided, wouldn't it be nice to publish this correspondence between Wells and Eisenstein? So I wrote to Wells, and I asked him about it. And he told me how wonderful it would be. And I waited a month, and I got a letter back, and it said something to the effect that he was most pleased and flattered by my interest, but that he had never kept the correspondence. It is my feeling that the correspondence may have been mythical, because there's no trace of it in Moscow. And if you've seen, once one's seen Eisenstein's library and his apartment, one knows that he kept everything. And but in any case, Wells and Sternberg, the two directors whom you mentioned, obviously the most interesting directors to think about, I think, in relation to Eisenstein, for a great many reasons, probably. And part of it has to do with that largeness of gesture and expression. Yes?
You mentioned the use of drapery in the kabuki tradition. Can you identify any other elements of the kabuki theater in Ivan?
Well, it's a little hard. I think one is the pace. That is the way, the slowness of gesture and the pace of it, the kind of ecstatic temporality of Ivan. We know, of course, that Eisenstein was extremely interested in kabuki. You know, in Japanese culture in general, he studied Japanese when he was in the army. He was interested in all Oriental theater. He's written about kabuki. He mentions in his writing on the general line that kabuki, the way in which the kabuki actor, through slowness and through repetition, is involved in a kind of analysis of movement, was very important. And so I think one has the feeling in Eisenstein that the extreme, what is usually called stylization of gesture, but stylization is a word that doesn't mean very much. It has something to do with the time of gesture, with its pace, with the kinds of rhythms that it describes. It has to do with the weight given to gesture. It has to do with the relationship of gestures to each other. All of those things, I think, are part of what we mean by stylization. And that, I think, can be traced to his interest in kabuki. There are probably other things as well. including the extreme, and well, it's also part of gesture, if you like, which is the extreme importance given to, almost autonomous articulations of various parts of the face, treated very often like masks.
You mentioned between part 1 and part 2, you did not differentiate between the official receptions of both of these. You just dwelled on the condemnation of part 2,
Yes.
as if part 1 had been received in the same light.
No, I'm sorry. I certainly didn't want to give that impression. Part 1 was Part 1 was officially well received. That is, it received Stalin's imprimatur without any difficulty. He liked it very much. That does not mean that its public reception was particularly warm. It was not, really. There were people who liked it, but on the whole, it was a film which Stalin seemed to have a much better appreciation of it than William Hellman. Part 2, of course, it was banned. It was not released until many years later. And I think it is still the feeling, by the way, in the Soviet Union that, this was a costly, somewhat pretentious mistake on the part of many people. Yes. Oh, yes. And by the way, it's very amply documented in Film Sense and in other writings which have been published in France. He speaks a great deal about his work.
Was he working with his closely? Was he had been left here with intelligence?
He seems to work as closely. He hasn't written in as much detail about it, but from what he does say, and there are texts that have been published in Russian and in French and that are not available in English, he seems to work quite closely for this as well.
Was he coordinating formal competition in the shop with the
I'm not sure. He gives that impression, but I'm not sure. I'm not absolutely sure. Yes.
Am I correct in thinking that only Alexander Nevsky was spontaneously popular on its initial release? The remainder, all of the rest of his films were popular only after they were released abroad, or just were not basically very popular within the Soviet Union?
Oh, let's see. I think that's kind of it. That is, I don't really know what the reaction to Strike was. That's never been made clear. But Potemkin was well received. It was very well received, but it was its European reputation which made Eisenstein. There is a wonderful photograph that I have, which shows a young man in a fur hat and a coat coming out of someplace, probably a doorway, with an absolutely radiant smile. And it is a frame from a newsreel made of Eisenstein when he was emerging from the Bolshoi Theater after the very first public screening, the world premiere of Potemkin. And he's radiant. It had been extremely well received. But without, the incredible European and worldwide welcome given to Potemkin. It was a film whose success in Germany, as you know, was overwhelming. The French hailed it as the first great surrealist film they made, because they had not yet made their own films, and the montage of Potemkin corresponded to their notion of, the joining of disparate entities to create a new reality. And it was a film which also was seen, as you know, by the Americans, and Mary Pickford and Douglas Fairbanks, as you know, invited Eisenstein to come to Hollywood. So it was a film which was extremely well received everywhere, and the international projection of Potemkin simply gave Eisenstein a prestige that no other filmmaker at the time had, but the film was well received. As for October, perhaps in some ways his greatest work, was liked by very few people. And when I say very few people, I don't mean simply party hacks. Minkowski didn't like it, Tchaikovsky had objections, everybody had objections to October. I think when you examine them quite carefully, as I have, that they're very ill-founded. but it was a difficult film for people. As for the general line, we don't know too much about its reception. But Nevsky, his least interesting film, was, go ahead. Yes, so.
What fascinated me most when you were talking today was about when you said that he enjoyed very much young Mr. Lincoln by Ford. Given the notions of what we accept about Western mentality, or taking into consideration things such as geographic or temperature, informing characters, or even thoughts about that type of genre, and looking into Eisenstein's first 4 or 5 films in terms of proximity of people and masses. And when you were talking about, he appreciated in terms of the harmony of things within the film, that seems to be a vague or quite a distancing between a person that would say at some other time in his life that basically aesthetics is conflict.
No.
And I would like to see if you could expound on how he came to like, or if he would have come to like a film like The Ford was named after a while.
That's a little difficult. I don't know exactly how he came, but first of all, Eisenstein, in that essay, I noticed something like 10 people started to get up and leave when I started reading from that essay. In that essay, Eisenstein is obviously expressing his admiration for work which, as I indicated before, is very, very far from anything he himself could create. And he says more than I wrote to you. I didn't want to drive everybody out of the auditorium, so I didn't read much more. But he admires its harmony, but its harmony is a very particular thing. He describes it as classical. But what he has in mind is a work that is classical in terms of its being completely in tune with its culture. That is, that there is, as it were, no distance between the work and the culture from which it emerges. That is, it looks back to a time happier than the one in which Eisenstein works, the one in which all modern artists work, by the way. And that is a time, of course, when the mythology of a nation expresses with a certain kind of immediacy and spontaneity its life, and a time when its artists express with a certain kind of immediacy and spontaneity its myths. He goes on in that essay, by the way, to talk about the ways in which the work is not a completely faithful picture of reality. That is, he says, of course we know about Lincoln. He was a much more complex character than Ford makes out. He was by no means, a saint. We also know that the Civil War brought in its wake a certain amount of destruction as well, etc. I mean, he's very aware of the complexity of the situation, but he seems to be attracted to the film in a way that he was attracted to Mexico. That is, he's drawing on his memories of the New World, and on his memories of that kind of culture in which the artist is in consonance with his culture, and probably in doing so, he was driven by really the sense of what he lacked, because he was a man constantly in conflict with his own culture and with the demands being made upon artists in that culture. He still is. It's interesting and in a sense sad to see that Eisenstein is still not really, in a way, an accepted figure in the Soviet Union. He's still disquieting. He still poses problems. Not someone about whom you can talk lucidly and unsentimentally. And he once said that in notes that he wrote in his journal, that Mayakovsky had died 2 deaths. The first was his suicide, and the other was the process of mythification to which he was subjected by the Stalinist regime. And Eisenstein too has died 2 deaths because he's certainly been enshrined as, you know, an international world celebrity. But the really innovative and rebellious aspects of Eisenstein are skimmed over. I imagine that's our last. Well, okay, one more. Let me go home.
In the Odessa step sequence, Potemkin, the sequence has an enormous cinematic power and flow, but the narrative sense of it is irrational, it's broken up. We see things that are supposed to happen on the step, but it carries along, despite the fact that it's not realistic or representational. I was wondering, do you know of any other directors who subsequently have used this same technique, wherein they totally destroy the realistic sense of what they're presenting in the interest of cinematic power? And specifically, I'm wondering if Abel Gance did this in LaRue, a film nobody has ever, at least very few people in the United States have seen because it's not available for distribution.
Well, I don't agree with your description of the Odessa steps.
Well, okay, well, I'm thinking in particular, we were examining the film in class. The Cossacks appear at the foot of the steps almost 45 or 50 seconds before the titles suddenly say, Cossacks arrive, and it starts swinging. We see people shot, again, early in the step sequence, and then they appear later on falling. But there's an enormous amount of time. It's not just a case of the time being stretched as in the pouring of the gold overnight, it's a case of events being transposed.
It happens in other sequences in other films too. But what I don't quite see is the way you described. I mean, what you say is true, but I don't see that it does what you say it does to one sense of the narrative. I'm not sure what you meant there.
Well, it looks representational until one examines it very closely. But I mean, that involves working on a Steenbeck set or something like that. I was wondering if other directors have totally destroyed the reality of an event to recreate it cinematically.
Oh, well, yes. I mean, in all kinds of different ways. Stan Brakhage has, Ken Jacobs has. I mean, the New American Cinema has done a great deal in that direction. That is by simply, jumbling is not the word, but by restructuring, the temporal succession of events through the use, through montage. Certainly, there are other filmmakers who've done that. Okay, I guess that's it for this evening. Thank you.